be diving into ISO and exposure in your photography and in your photos and what that means when you are trying to take a photograph and capture the light. First of all, what ISO stands for, which this kind of irks me that it's not perfect for ISO, stands for International Organization for Standards. An organization comes up with the ISO numbers that are universal for all camera types, no matter where you are at in the world. ISO is measured the same way. Which ISO goes in 100s and then it's doubled down. So as you're in this lower 100, you are going to have great quality images, high resolution, really clean and nice and clear. As you start going up higher with your number of your ISO, it's not going to be as great of a quality of photograph, but you're going to be able to capture situations where there's very low light. Now, what these numbers mean, so 100 is the base that you start off at. If you go up to 200 in your ISO, your camera is now twice as sensitive to the light when taking your photograph. If you go up to 400, now it's 4 times as sensitive with capturing the light in your photograph. If you go up to the 800, it's 8 times as sensitive to the light and to the exposure. And it just keeps going on and on and on for how sensitive it is of capturing that light. Now, we stated up above, like the best quality images that you can get would be with these lower ISOs, but sometimes we want to take photographs of things that have low light, so we have to use these ISOs. Now, if you have a DSLR camera and it's been stuck in auto ISO mode, we don't have the capability, the control that we really need as artists. If you compare it to a professional race car driver, they don't have their automobiles in automatic because they know their machine, they know how to push and pull it to get it to do what they need to do. It's the same for photographers. We need to learn how to work our machine so we have complete, utter control, because sometimes our auto won't be able to do what we really could want it to do. So just to touch back on image quality and what this means in your photograph. So if you take a look of this blade of grass, the first image up on the top left is a 100 ISO. Then we go to 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and 12,800 ISO, I believe it is right there. As we get to this bottom row, it starts getting noisy, as we call it in photography, meaning it has this graininess, this pixelated look that these photographs are not that great of a quality. Up here in the top, there's not that big of a difference. We start to see it a little bit in the 400, a little bit more in the 800, but not nearly as bad as these high ISOs down here. That we don't really want this if we don't have to take it in this high ISO. We want to avoid this noisiness. Here's another example of the noise, the graininess that happens once you get into those higher ISOs, how it affects your subject, how it affects your photography with that graininess, which some people may like. Most people generally do not like the look of this. So here's a good rule to go by. If you, like I, and like many others, do not like that look, that we really don't want to use the highest ISOs. And when you're metering and learning about how to figure out which ISO to use, generally you want to use about 2 lower than that. Now, the highest of all the ISOs generally you only use in a low light situation that is an emergency that you need to take. Like the example, Bigfoot stepping off a UFO in the middle of the night talking with Tupac and Elvis. Like that would be something that I need to capture really quickly if there's low light. So boom, take a photograph, but it's going to be grainy. It's not going to be good image quality. So when to use the certain ISOs when you're taking your photographs. So the first one, the 100 ISO, is great for things that are not moving. So you would want to use things like a tripod, where it's standing still, it's stable. Thing like landscape photography would be great for this low ISO where we're really trying to capture the light, but there's a good amount of light happening that we don't need to go into this low or the high range for a low light example. So 100 ISO, great for landscape, still lifes, things like that that are not moving. Going into the 200s, so this is for things that might be moving, that you're trying to capture in real life, real time. You possibly don't have a tripod with you, so we are going to heighten up our ISO to make for a stable image. As we get up into the 400 ISO area, that would be great for when you're like taking pictures of a sports event and they're moving around, they're running around like crazy, and you need to capture them in the moment without a blur. That coincides with shutter speed, which we'll be introducing not next week, but the week after, which deals with capturing that image in that moment, in that split second, and not having the graininess show. Now we're getting into the 800s, which it's not a bad ISO. This is like when you have low light, possibly at night. There's a little bit of light, but not a lot. You still will have pretty good quality, not the graininess, and you still can enlarge for the most part and not have that grainy noisiness show. So now we're getting into our bigger numbers. So these, after 800, we start getting into 1600 and on. This is where when you have low light, like the example over here on the right, it's at night, you have a little bit of light from the street lamps, but not a whole light to go on. This is when we need a higher ISO and a faster shutter speed to deal with the blur that might happen. And this image, you do start to see some noise in it, some graininess. And this is what I'm talking about, a little bit of a blur, like this lady moving right here. In 3200, so this is when you're trying to freeze an object, scene, a person, and it's in low light. You want to have the higher ISO and a faster shutter speed as well. But this one, we definitely can start to see the noise in the top right-hand corner of that graininess, that noisiness happening. Even bigger ISO. Now, this one looks good from afar for this photograph. So this is a fast shutter speed, high ISO to capture this moment. But if we were to enlarge, we would definitely see the graininess happen. Even in these really dark black areas, it would be grainy. Still makes for a good photograph when it's small, but not that great big. So here's a little guideline for how to use specific ISOs. So the lower the number, the higher the quality of the photograph. The higher the number, the higher sensitivity it has, and we will have not that great of a photograph quality wise. So generally we want to keep the ISO as low as possible, the exposure as low as we can. We raise the ISO if we need a faster shutter speed, if things are moving fast, or you need more depth of field, so longer view range. We'll talk about metering just slightly, which it coincides with ISO and exposure, which metering, if you have a DSLR camera at home, you could practice metering your object and seeing what type of exposure it looks like. If it meters on this left-hand side, it means it is darker. If it meters over here on the lighter side, it's going to be lighter, which means we would need a lower ISO and a higher ISO over on this side. So hopefully this makes sense to you. If you're still a little unsure, I would recommend going back and re-watching this and taking notes over some parts that you are a little confused about. Next thing that you have to do is take your quiz over ISO about this presentation, and then you will start taking photographs with different ISO numbers and seeing what that does to your photographs. Happy photo taking.